Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Great Warriors in World History. Of course, war is a very terrible thing, but it's a reality of life and of history, and therefore warriors have played an important role in history. And I think, in my opinion, great warriors have had certain noble qualities which we all need to develop, including courage, especially, and kindness. The military leader has to care about the men under his command for morale. You know, it's tough keeping the morale up in war because it's so horrible. The killing others and getting killed, possibility of getting killed. Respect for the enemy. Respect, so important, especially the defeated enemy. Humility, another very important quality so that the leader will be, again, for morale of the troops. And in a world where slavery has existed and has been a desire to enslave others, the warrior plays a very important role in preserving freedom. Okay, so let's get started. The first warrior, Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 BC. Of course, he was the great Greek warrior from ancient Greece, and in fact, during his life and for centuries afterward, he was like a superhero in the Mediterranean. Little boys who had looked up to him. And a few stories. Now the thing is, he created a vast empire all the way from Greece to India. And when he got to India, which is the great Holy Land, the land of spirituality, he met a saint whom he couldn't intimidate. You know, the saints aren't afraid of anything. You know, they're united with God. And Alexander had met his match. He finally met an enemy he couldn't defeat, and he decided it was time to turn around and head back home. Of course, he died on the way. Another really good story about Alexander early on, when he was expanding east, is that he, after defeating a certain area, he had a banquet. A meal with some of the local people and his soldiers. And at that dinner, he wore clothing that was worn by those people. And his own soldiers were upset. They're like, "What are you doing this? This is terrible," because people have a tendency to think, "Oh, our culture is the best," and look down on other cultures. Now that's something a great warrior can't do. So he was showing respect for these people. And one of the very important qualities of a great warrior is winning people over. The war is one thing, but if you want to create an empire that's going to be peaceful, is you have to win people over, not just defeat them in war, but win that, like they used to say, winning hearts and minds. And that was a good example of him doing that. So that was wonderful. And I think the thing is, the ancient Greeks were one of the most advanced peoples in the world. And so when Alexander created his empire, mostly going east from Greece to India, he brought these Greek ideas, which were very progressive, ideas of democracy and of learning, to areas which didn't have that, which didn't have these high ideas, this advanced culture. So I thought that was very good. Alexander the Great. Hannibal Barca. Not Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal was a great leader of Carthage, which was an empire in North Africa, and he was. This was during the time when the Roman Empire's rival was Carthage, and the great story is, the great image of Hannibal is his army using elephants, traveling through Switzerland, coming and attacking Rome from the north, sort of a surprise attack. They said in the Second World War, when there was fighting, General George Patton, the U.S., believed he was, or I think there was some reference that he believed he was a reincarnation of Hannibal. So Hannibal, the great leader, military warrior from North Africa. Gaius Julius Caesar, mostly known as Julius Caesar, 144 BC. Of course, the famous warrior from the Roman Empire. Yeah, and he was off fighting in France and in England, and then the story of him coming home. He was a guy. This happens where the military leader, of course, very often you have the military and leader who is a political leader as well. But in this case, it was a Roman republic, actually, where they had a separation, where he was not a political leader, but he transitioned into one. This happens quite a bit. There's the famous story of when he was not supposed to bring his army back to Rome, but he did, and he decided to go for it. And he crossed the Rubicon River, which is somewhere in Italy, and he said, "I have crossed the Rubicon," which means, I guess, that was the point of no return, which has become this famous expression, crossing the Rubicon, Julius Caesar. And then he became, from what I read in his biography, a good political leader of ancient Rome. But he was. They decided to kill him. The Ides of March, terrible. These senators came out and with knives and stabbed him to death, horrible, in Rome, and including Brutus, the famous saying, "Et tu, Brute," "You too, Brutus? You're part of this?" And then the famous Caesar's commentaries on, back then France was called Gaul, and the famous line is, all of Gaul is divided into 3 parts. So Julius Caesar, really one of the most famous warriors in history. Okay, Attila the Hun. Oh boy, 400s AD. Yeah, the Huns, which were like a Central Asian people, and there's been a lot of movement in the Eurasian landmass. And there was a lot of movement from west to east, and the Huns were part of this. And he's famous for his so-called sacking of Rome, and one of the events which was part of the fall of the Roman Empire, Attila the Hun. And in the First World War, I guess the Huns contributed to what became Germany, the German people and the Huns. And so the First World War, part of the army propaganda, they called the Germans Huns. And I remember my grandmother, who was a young woman in the First World War, referred to the Germans as the Huns. But they really sort of a part of what became Germany, or the German people were Huns. And actually the thing is that there was a German invasion of way back of England. And so actually the English people themselves have Germanic blood. Attila the Hun, who has kind of a bad reputation of being very violent and coming and destroying the Roman Empire. Saladin, 1137 to 1193. Now, he's a very interesting guy. He was a Kurd. He was a Muslim leader in the Middle East, ruling parts in Syria and Egypt. And this was he lived during the Crusades, when land which is really holy for Jewish people, Christians, and Muslims at the time had become Muslim ruled, and then Christians were coming from Europe to try to take what for their holy land, the land where Jesus Christ lived. And Saladin was a warrior fighting those the European Crusaders. And the thing is, Saladin was a very great, brave, effective warrior, but he was a good guy. And he was a just man. He was humane. That's so important, because some of these guys are very cruel. And in recent decades, when Saddam Hussein was talked about being the next Saladin, he wanted to be the next. The thing is, Saddam, remember the dictator of Iraq, who's been gone for a while now, and he went to war with the U.S. Saddam invaded Kuwait, and Saddam wanted to be the next Saladin, and the thing is, he could not, because Saddam Hussein was cruel, and Saladin was a kind man, also a great leader. Well, of course, he was referring to Saladin's military successes. So Saladin was a great Muslim warrior. Richard the Lionheart was his opponent in the famous one of the Crusades. Richard the Lionheart, 1157 to 1199. He was a king of England, but I think he spent his time in France when there was joint rule. And he was this Christian leader, from England, leading one of the Crusades, trying to take the Holy Land, what's now Israel, land of Jerusalem, and so forth, or also known as Palestine, from the Muslims. And the thing that was strange about Richard the Lionheart is that, in the book that I read, is that he, there was a long trip from England and France, and back then transportation was tough, and that apparently, from what I read, when he was close to Jerusalem, and he gave up. He thought, oh, I guess maybe he was tired or demoralized. And I thought, how could you stop? This was the goal of the Crusades, was taking Jerusalem, the holy city, were founded by King David of ancient Israel, and where Jesus died, was crucified and died, and he lost heart, because after everything they'd been through. Richard the Lionheart. Genghis Khan, 1162 to 1227. Of course, he has a very bad reputation for cruelty, but the thing is, the Mongol Empire, which he established, was a vast, vast empire, and included Russia and China. And the thing is, because of the creation of the great thing about an empire is that it creates law and order. Now, if you have many small kingdoms and you're trying to travel, and as soon as you get to the frontier, it's always tough going from one kingdom to the next, in the old days especially, because very often they were at war, so you would have trouble. So it was, international travel was tough. But with the Mongol Empire, the best example is Marco Polo, who traveled from Europe to China, and reported what he'd seen and the great things they had, which Europeans valued, like silk and spices, and kind of stimulated the desire for the age of exploration. Now he could not have made that trip if the Mongol Empire didn't exist. So once you got into the Mongol Empire, of course you had to get in and enter the border. As soon as you got in, okay, then you faced the rule of law, stability, and you didn't have to be constantly worrying about political issues of transferring from one kingdom to another or one country to another. So the Mongol Empire. Yeah, this is one of the great. Same thing, the Roman Empire. These empires. That was the advantage. You could travel easily. With small empires, you can't do that. You're pretty much stuck. You can't go into the next empire, the next kingdom, because chances are you're enemies. So you're kind of limited where you can live. Genghis Khan, William Wallace, 1270 to 1305, Scotland. Yeah, his life was portrayed in the famous movie Braveheart with Mel Gibson. Yeah, and he's considered Scottish. I have a friend, a pen pal in Scotland. He doesn't like the movie. He thinks it's not that good. Kind of, I don't know. I guess it's not very historically accurate, which is often happens in movies. But the great leader of Scotland, who tried to, of course, Scotland became a part of the UK, the United Kingdom, dominated by England. And William Wallace was fighting to preserve the freedom and independence of Scotland. William Wallace, and apparently he, like the movie, he was when he was finally captured and arrested and sentenced to death. Yeah, he faced this sort of gruesome death where his body was torn apart. But I'm sure he's still very much revered by the Scottish people today. Timur the Lame, or Tamerlane, 1336 to 1405. This was a Turco-Mongol Persianate guy. So this is part of the vast Central Asia. Has been a lot of movements of people. He's considered people of Afghanistan revere him as a great hero, and he was created one of these empires which are kind of not well known today because Central Asia is sort of an obscure part of the world. And so he was in the 1300s into the 1400s. Hernan Cortez, 1485 to 1547, the Spanish conqueror of Mexico. Oh, just an unbelievable story. And this is how he just had such a small number of men and faced this mighty empire. It's just an incredible story how the Spanish defeated the Aztecs, because they really were outnumbered. But again, he was a very brave man, and actually it's kind of sad in his case, because when he expected, the Spanish, they didn't have rule of law, and he wanted to become famous and achieve glory and wealth and fame, and his wealth, he acquired wealth through his conquests, but he died. His property was confiscated because they didn't have rule of law. People would make up stories, and he lost everything, and he died sort of this lonely, bitter old man, which was was sad, but. Anyway, I guess that was his karma. But it's unbelievable how the Spanish conquest of Mexico, and there were different reasons, but a big part was that the the Aztecs were not divided. In fact, they had a slave empire, horrible religion, which involved human sacrifices and these Aztec priests eating human hearts and having blood going all the way down on their chest. Horrible. And so you could say, oh, the Spanish were so terrible. I think the Spanish conquest of Mexico was an improvement. Except, yes, of course, you had the decimation of the population through death from disease. This happened all over the Americas. But I think when the Mexicans became Christian, I know the Spanish weren't very Christian, or practicing Christianity, but the ideal was there in Jesus Christ's life, which is so noble and wonderful to love God and love each other. But anyway, Cortez's conquest of Mexico is really an amazing thing, and you have to give the Spanish credit for their, they went for it. They tried to do things that would seem impossible. How could you do something like this with such a small army of dozens or hundreds, small number of men against an empire of millions, and expect to succeed? Unbelievable. Hernan Cortez. Francisco Pizarro, the counterpart in South America, pretty much the same thing, 1471 to 1541. Pizarro was Spanish, and he defeated the Inca Empire. Oh, and same thing, small numbers of Spanish soldiers against an empire of millions. But again, I mean, the Inca Empire had all these divisions. That's what they say, divide and conquer. Well, if the enemy is already divided, you don't have to divide them. They're already divided. And you can take advantage of those divisions to defeat them. Francisco Pizarro. Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, 1502 to 1572, the Spanish warrior who started the conquest of the Philippines. Yeah, so actually very tragic for Filipinos, but this is history. We've seen his tomb in San Agustin Church in Intramuros, Old Manila. And there's Legazpi City. My sister-in-law, Stella. My wife, Alice, and her family lived in Legazpi City for a while, and her sister, Stella, used to talk about it a lot. Miguel Legazpi. And I remember I met a Dr. Legazpi. So anyway, this guy who started this, he started the Spanish conquest of the Philippines. Napoleon Bonaparte, one of my favorites, 1769 to 1821. Really interesting. He was from Corsica. So not the main part, which is an island in the Mediterranean, French island, big island. And Napoleon was amazing because, it was part of the French Revolution led to war, and then there was, they say in the military, you have to gradually rise through the ranks, unless there's a war. And if there's a war, then you can rise, because they really need good leaders in a war. And he was a great leader, and a tremendous leader, and a very interesting fellow. And of course, he eventually became the top military leader of France, and led the French conquest of Europe, which a short-lived French Empire of Europe, and was, of course, defeated in Russia. And the thing is, about Napoleon, his ideas, or not his ideas, but the ideals of the French Revolution were spread, and these were good ideals, and a lot of people died, and in fact, they weren't always practicing them, but those ideals helped change a lot of countries because they questioned the idea, the legitimacy of kings. And, they talked a lot about the equality of man, these ideals that everyone deserves respect. And back then, that people didn't believe that. They thought, the nobility are superior, and they have the rights to enjoy more material things, and the poor just have to live sort of lives kind of like farm animals. Just work and just subsistence. And so this really shook things up, and it was good. And actually, it led to a change in the Philippines, because Spain ruled the Philippines, and this idea is that, the government should really serve the people, not just have a good time and enjoy themselves. And this led to a governor going to the Philippines from Spain who decided to do that, and then this raised Filipinos' expectations of being better treatment by their government, and actually inspired their war of independence against Spain. Napoleon Bonaparte, really interesting fellow. And the thing I liked about him, when he finally was captured for the second time and exiled and imprisoned on St. Helena Island in the Atlantic, pretty hot climate, not too far from the equator. He spent the last 6 years of his life there, I believe, and the thing is, he lost everything. But and at that time, he really showed an ability of character because he was very respectful, and he was living with some difficult people, and he wasn't treated well by the British. He was a prisoner of the British, and I thought he really showed an ability of character at the end of his life. He was a good fellow, and he actually established the Napoleonic Code, which brought which really improved the legal system of France. He's still highly regarded in France today. His remains were brought back and buried in Paris. Andrew Jackson, 1767 to 1845. In the United States, he became a president. He was fought the Indians in the ongoing Indian Wars. He's mostly known for defeating the British at the Battle of New Orleans in January of 1815, when the U.S. had defeated the Great Britain for independence, but there was another war of 1812, and the British were looking to take New Orleans and control the access to the Mississippi River system, which was a big deal. That was the highway of America, and establish really their own, like a colony, a British colony there. And they were defeated. Jackson defeated them. So this is a great moment in American history. It really led to him becoming president of the United States. He was a very brave man, and sometimes he had a temper, but he was also a just man. Andrew Jackson. Simon Bolivar, the great liberator in South America, northern part of South America, and the country of Bolivia is named after him. And he was fighting for independence for these, what became the countries in northern South America, like Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, that area in the northern part, and fighting the Spanish for independence in the early part of the 19th century. And his counterpart, Jose de San Martin, down south, 1778 to 1850, the liberator of Argentina, Chile, and Peru, fighting for independence for those countries, which were long-time Spanish colonies, and defeated and so these two men, Bolivar and San Martin, were the main leaders leading these Spanish colonies in South America, becoming independent countries. And then also another guy, Bernardo O'Higgins, who was Irish descent in Chile. George Washington, 1732 to 1799, the great warrior who led the British colonies in North America to independence, in the War of Independence against Great Britain. And the thing is about Washington, the quality about him, of course he became president, he was a good man, and he endured, and they really couldn't defeat the British in battle, although they did have the big victory at Yorktown. But mostly, what Washington did mostly is endure and not give up. And the war went on and on and on. He didn't give up, and he was a good man. He was kind. That kept the morale up of his troops. He was kind. He was brave, and he was a just man, a good man, an honest man, wonderful father of our country, the United States. George Washington. Tecumseh, 1768 to 1813. He was an American Indian, a Shawnee warrior, born in Ohio. He moved around a lot. He tried to organize or unite American Indian nations or tribes to stop Western expansion. And he failed because I think he was meant to fail, but still he's highly respected today. In fact, one of the great generals from the Civil War, General William Tecumseh Sherman, has his middle name Tecumseh, so he was highly respected. He was the noble opponent. Yes, the Americans were fighting him, but he was a good fellow, and what he failed in what he tried to do. But I think there's no failure in life if you try to do something. And what he tried to do, I think, wasn't going to happen because the Europeans kept coming from Europe. The population was growing, and then they developed the Industrial Revolution. There was no way to stop that, but he tried. And sometimes you do something, and maybe it's a doomed cause, but I think there still is greatness in trying to do something like that. And he lived a very noble life, good man. Osceola, similar fellow. He was a Seminole Indian in Florida. Similar situation, except actually in Osceola's case, although he was captured and imprisoned, died in prison. There were a number of Seminoles who the U.S. finally gave up and said, okay, you can stay in Florida. They were trying to get them all to give up and move them west to what's now Oklahoma and what was then the Indian Territory. And I think Osceola was the great, even though he was captured, but he inspired his people, the Seminole people, to fight. And you still have Seminole Indians today in Florida because of his inspiration. Geronimo, another American Indian who was an Apache fighting the U.S. Army in the Southwest in New Mexico. And that's this famous expression, Geronimo. In fact, the Cincinnati Reds had a center fielder, Cesar Geronimo, in the 1970s. Geronimo. Crazy Horse, who was a Great Plains. I have some of these guys here on my T-shirt. He was a Lakota Indian, the Great Plains, 1840 to 1877. Crazy Horse, same thing, trying to stop American expansion or European American expansion west. Red Cloud, another Lakota Indian, 1822 to 1909. He lived parts of his life in Nebraska and South Dakota. Yeah, the similar region and the same type of thing, fighting this losing battle against American expansion, European American expansion west. Ulysses S. Grant, 1822 to 1885. He was the great military leader who helped the United States remain one country. When southern states had formed a country, the Confederate States of America, and tried to break away. And a war was fought to keep the United States one country and to end slavery. And he had a very bad reputation in the South. They called him Butcher Grant because, he prosecuted these battles in which so many young men died. But the thing is that it had to happen. It had to happen. Sometimes you have to do, he was a good man. He didn't, and Lincoln, who was his boss, and they worked together, Abraham Lincoln, the president, they were both humane men, but they wanted the country to stay one, and it was a very terrible price that was paid. But he said, well, this is the job that has to be done, and he did it, and he won, and he helped the United States win the war, and because if we had broken into two countries, we could have broken into three or four or more, and been like Central America, we could have been a bunch of little countries and very ineffective, and we couldn't. And then you'd have trouble traveling across the country you'd have to get a visa to go to Florida or California, and we couldn't have played the role we did, the important role we played in the Second World War in defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Douglas MacArthur, 1880 to 1964. He was. His father was Arthur MacArthur, who was part of the early days of the U.S. occupation and conquest of the Philippines. And MacArthur spent a lot of his time in the Philippines, and was leader of U.S. forces in the Philippines, U.S. and Philippine forces, when Japan invaded in 1941 and in 1942. And of course he left, went to Australia, but he came. He said, "I shall return," and he did. And he led he was a major leader in the American war effort in the Pacific against Japan. But I think and a very brave guy. Oh gosh, he would go to these battle scenes where there was still fighting. And he did, bullets would be, flying. He didn't care, and they were always scared he was going to get killed. And George Washington did that as well. And he was a very brave guy. And I know one time he came in Intramuros to the walled city in Manila, and he was staring at a Japanese soldier on a wall. He didn't even, he wasn't armed. He's the leader. And this soldier's just looking at him and finally staring down, and finally the guy left. Very brave fella, incredibly brave. He risked his life many times, and he'd go in these areas where the fighting was still going on. But I think the greatness of Douglas MacArthur came after the war in his rule of the Philippines. For about 5 years, he was during the occupation of Japan by the U.S. Army. He was a tremendous, talk about respect for the noble opponent. As soon as the war was over, he did everything he could for the Japanese people and their welfare, and helping them to become a democracy. And they were having all kinds of, they were really starving. So he was really wanted to make sure that they had food and that the economy would rebound and life and that life, they'd suffered a lot in the war. So he did so much for those people, and he became a very beloved man in Japan. Douglas MacArthur. Dwight Eisenhower, the American leader in the Second World War in Europe, who was the leader organized the invasion of Normandy, France, when the war, it had been an air war. lot of airplanes, bombing missions going from Germany to England and vice versa. And then it had to become a land war in the West. And he led this very tough invasion when a lot of guys died, June 6, 1944. He was the commander of that, which really had to happen. It was very terrifying, but they were able to establish a beachhead and then push the Germans back. And eventually, the following May, Germany surrendered. So he was this important leader and very important leader in the Second World War in Europe, and of course became U.S. president. I didn't write down here George C. Patton, who was another warrior or American general in the Second World War in Europe, and he saw here our allies was the Soviet Union, and one of the tragic things of the Second World War is that the trigger for the war was the German conquest of Poland, and then at the end of the war, so it's like, okay, we're fighting a war for freedom for Poland, and of course Poland ended up being occupied by the Soviet Union. So they didn't, and Eastern Europe ended up becoming enslaved by the Soviet Union and the communist way of life, communist government. And Patton wanted to fight the Russians then because he could see, here they were our allies, but they were actually, I think, worse than the Nazi Germany. Emilio Aguinaldo, 1869 to 1964, great great warrior in the Philippines, fighting the Spanish for independence, and then the Americans who came and replaced Spain as the imperial power. He was defeated, but I think he was a good fella, and he's controversial. He had the issues of the death of Bonifacio, who had actually started the revolution that he was involved in, but the revolution had divided into, it's like a civil war within the revolution, tough situation. But, after the war, finally, Filipinos were disappointed, but they did not become independent. He dedicated his life to veterans, Filipino veterans of the fighting of the war against Spain and France. He was a good man. Erwin Rommel, they called him the Desert Fox. He was a German general in North Africa. And he was also involved in the plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, this crazy leader of Germany. And he had to commit suicide to avoid having his family really ashamed and punished as well. Erwin Rommel. They call him the Desert Fox. Toussaint Louverture, 1743 to 1803, the leader of the Haitian independence, War of Independence of the slaves of Haiti, Saint-Domingue, the French colony in the Caribbean, against France. Was able to achieve independence for Haiti, 1804. He himself was captured and taken to France and died in prison. Very tragic. He's highly regarded. He's like the George Washington of Haiti. And this really inspired the victory of the Haitian slaves. Really inspired slaves everywhere. And American slaves knew about this. They were inspired because. That it was possible to fight for freedom, and he achieved that. Although Haiti's had all kinds of problems since then, political problems, but they've been free. They've been free. Robert Mugabe, born in 1924, he's alive today at age 95. He was the leader of the war in what was a British colony of Rhodesia in southern Africa, now known as Zimbabwe. Actually a very tragic man because he was the great. He was like the George Washington of Zimbabwe, but then he became a dictator. He was finally had a coup d'etat. He lost power only within the last year or two. Very tragic. He became actually a terrible dictator. So this was very, very sad, very hard for those people, to have their national hero become a national villain. Okay, Emiliano Zapata, 1879 to 1919. Mexico had a pretty terrible civil war for like 10 years. When they had this dictator, I can't remember his name, but anyway, Emiliano Zapata was one of the leaders fighting in this Mexican Civil War, which went on and on. In fact, he's highly regarded today. He was killed in war, and Viva Zapata is a Mexican expression. If you meet a Mexican, you can say that. They'll like it. Pancho Villa, and finally Pancho Villa, 1878 to 1923. He was another fellow from the Mexican Revolution who Led an army fighting against other different factions, and at one point he invaded the U.S. and he was like they're going on raids. The U.S. went into Mexico fighting the U.S. Army fighting Pancho Villa because he'd go across the border and like his army would steal things, horses, whatever, and go back into Mexico. So he became a problem for the United States government, U.S. Army. So anyway, that's the topic. That's today's topic. There are many, many more great warriors. They deserve respect, because they risk their lives. And again, in a world where slavery has been a reality, freedom is no joke. And if countries that have not been enslaved for a long, long time really don't value freedom. It's only the countries that have, had been enslaved and fought for freedom these are the people I think that really value warriors. In today's culture, very often we see, the warrior is just some violent guy, and everything. No, they deserve respect, and they're brave. And a great warrior is a man who's brave and smart and hardworking and enduring and kind and respectful and patient. So anyway, so that concludes today's presentation. Great warriors in world history. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.